So somebody had asked about doing a video on heat treating in the forge, and I thought that was an awesome idea, so I'm going to totally do it right now. Got excited. Anyway, so the heat treating in the forge is an awesome way to go about it. It means you don't have to own another piece of equipment that you wouldn't have to necessarily buy, and it works for quite a few different steels. The first thing you want to consider is the kind of steel you're using. Not every steel is going to respond well to a forge heat treat. Some steels need the kiln or some variation thereof to control the temperature well enough to heat treat them. The steels you want to stick with are, generally speaking, simple carbon steels that are down below the 0.9% carbon content. Once you get past that 0.89% carbon content, you hit into what's called a hypereutectoid steel. You need to do something with that extra carbon, and the way you do something with that extra carbon is through temperature control. And it makes it very difficult to heat treat in a forge. Not that it can't be done, it just makes it more difficult, and it makes the results less reliable. Steels you want to stick with if you're going to heat treat in a forge. 1080, 1084, perfect. Those steels are simple heat treat, and they work amazing in a forge. Beyond that, you can do steels like 80 CRV2 or 5160, 9260, and even steels that are pretty high carbon but have a very simple chemistry. Things like W1 or W2 can be done in the forge, although those steels do respond better to a kiln or salt pot heat treat. I recommend when you're beginning and you're just starting out, just stick with 1080 or 1084. Those two steels are so easy, and they can be such high performance steels, there's not much else to really go. I mean, I still make about 75% of my mono steel knives out of 1084. I've been doing this a long time. So that said, the first thing we need to know is what steel we're using. If we're using 1080 or 1084 or anything around that mark, 1060, generally speaking, those steels austenize, or what we call critical temperature, right around 1475, 1450, 1475. Steels that have a little bit of chromium in them, things like 80 CRV2 or 5160, tend to austenize slightly higher. So the critical temperature will be around 1550 or 1575 even in some cases. That isn't to say that they won't harden from a lower temperature. You just won't get optimal performance. So the first thing when we're talking about heat treating in a forge is figuring out how to determine that temperature. I'm going to show you a couple ways to do it without anything expensive or any tools. The first way is to use Curie point, what everyone calls non-magnetic. There are some issues with that. Steel turns non-magnetic at 1413 degrees. That is a fixed point pretty much across all alloys. That's useful because it's so close to the heat treating temperatures. Go a little bit beyond that temperature and you're going to be able to heat treat it properly for these steels. The problem is it's still non-magnetic at 500 degrees, 2000 degrees, 1800 degrees. And there's no way to determine if you've exceeded that temperature greatly. Check it with a magnet, it's not magnetic, awesome, I'm going to harden it. Put it in the oil and it hardens. But you now have grain the size of sand because you hardened from 2000 degrees rather than the 1400 you were supposed to. And 1400 is a surprisingly cool color. So that's the first problem with it. The second problem is it doesn't really help us determine anything more than what that color looks like in the light that day. Every light, every situation is going to change how colors look. So relying strictly on colors without something to check it doesn't work well. It does work really well using a magnet to check the color of the light that day in that situation. So what you can do is take your knife, heat it up in the forge, and let the color kind of change gradually across the blade. Run the magnet off in the section it doesn't stick to. The coolest temperature that happens when it comes out of the forge, that's the temperature you want to bring the whole thing to and quench. Now the other problem is that as it cools, it doesn't regain magnetism at the same point. It doesn't regain magnetism until about 900 degrees. So you can really fool your eyes, and I don't find it to be a great method, and I really don't recommend it. There are two physical phenomena you can look for. One is called decoalescence and one is called recoalescence. One's on the way up and one's on the way down. Basically what's happening, as you heat a piece of steel, the carbon goes into solution. It takes energy to do that. It's making a new structure. It's a phase change. It takes that energy from the steel itself in the form of heat. So as you heat the steel up, it'll hit a temperature. All the carbon goes into solution at once, or more or less, and that phase change happens, and the whole thing cools off a little bit, and there'll be like this shadow that passes across the steel. It's really, really pretty. I've never once seen it in a gas forge. The gas flame always seems to block it. I can't see it. The only time I've been able to reliably see decoalescence is if I do it in what's called a muffle furnace. Put a tube through there so there's no oxygen, burn off the oxygen with a piece of charcoal. The times I've done it was at night in a darkened forge, and I put it into a coal forge and buried it and heated the tube up and used that radiant heat to heat the knife, and then I was able to see it. That's not generally practical for me, so I don't do that very often. I have also done it once or twice in a forge in a gas forge in a similar manner. And it can work really well, but I don't find it super practical. A much easier method is to use the inverse. And again, heat the steel up slowly so that you get a gradient across it, and you'll see a temperature change where as it cools, it'll reheat. That's called recoalescence. The coolest temperature that happened from is the temperature you're shooting for. Again, basically what happens is that carbon that went into solution and took energy releases it as it comes back out. Newton's law, can't destroy energy. So as you cool that steel down, and all you need to see it is a shadow. You'll see a kind of dark line play across the steel, and then a red line will follow it. It'll be very dull red, very subtle, and again, you need shadow or some darkness to see it. I don't think I'll be able to shoot that on camera. I'll try to shoot that on camera for another video, guys, later. But I'm gonna need, I think, some filters and stuff, and I don't think it'll work for this one. But I have an even easier method, especially if you're using 1080 or 1084. Table salt. I know, right? So kosher salt or table salt all melts at the same temperature. Chemically, it'll melt at 1474 degrees, which is right where we want to be. So what I'll do is I will bring my forge up to temperature at a fairly cool temperature. Not want to go above it into the reds. Just barely orange if you're doing ADC or V2. Just barely. But really for 1080 or 1084 or 1520 1084 Damascus, it wants to be just showing color, like dull cherry red. And then I'll sprinkle a little of this on here, put it in the forge, and I'll watch. When I see it melt all the way across, quench my steel, and it'll be hard. So let's do that now. I'm gonna just light my forge here. Helps if I turn the torch off. So again, I'm running this forge very, very cool. I have not a lot of gas coming through it, and I've choked down the burner. I want to have what's called a reducing atmosphere. I want to have more gas than I have air. That reduces scale, it reduces the buildup of scale, and it reduces decarb. And decarb can fool me when I go to see if this is hard. I don't want any decarb. I have a blade here prepared. So this is 1080, 15 and 20 Damascus integral I was working on. It just happened to be the only one ready to heat treat. It would work. Since I have a mass in here, I'm going to put this in backwards first. And that way I can preheat that mass a little bit so that this heats more evenly. Normally with integrals like this, I do them in the kiln so that everything comes up even temperature. But I didn't always have a kiln, so that's how I used to do it. I have the cutting edge away from the flame. In this forge, the flame hits the top, rolls around and comes down around the floor. And it's a reasonably even heat. But I don't want to have it hit the edge first, because the edge is going to flash heat and come up. So I want to turn the edge away from the flame so that the edge is facing the burner, so that it hits the back of that knife first. And I want to heat this reasonably slowly. I'm going to turn this up just a smidge. This is running just a little cold because it's completely cold forge to start. Bring this up. You can see already I have at like 800-900 degrees probably here, 7 or 8 in here, 7 or 8 in here, maybe 6 in here. See, that's not heating very evenly at all. We'll make up for that later. So I'm going to bring this to just barely red, and then I'm going to sprinkle some salt on here and turn it around. So a couple things to keep in mind. You want to hit that temperature, but you don't want to exceed it. If you exceed it, you want to cool back down below it. So below 900 degrees, like black heat, where it's regained magnetism, and then start over. If you are quenching from too high a temperature, you'll tend to get large grain, incomplete hardening, things you don't really want in your steel. And that quenching starts the moment you take it out of the fire. You have a certain amount of time to get below a certain temperature to make it happen. So like right now, if I pull this out, I'm quenching it, even though it's not going to go into the oil. I want to let it cool all the way to black. If I have exceeded that temperature, then I'll reset the grain and it'll start all over and it won't damage anything. Right now, like I said, I'm just trying to get that bolster area up to pretty close to temperature. There we go. I'm not bright red, but a very, very dull red. I have no idea how this will look on the camera. I'm going to just put a little salt on here. Well season my knife. Actually, I should have done that on the other side. I wasn't thinking. This salt's pretty cheap. Not a lot, just a little bit. And I'm going to put this in here. And I'm going to keep an eye on this. Bring the camera over here so maybe you can see. Alright, I've got this camera set up on the knife now. You can see in there, you can see how hard it is. This is looking a lot hotter on the camera than it is in reality. So don't judge anything by these colors. And I'm just kind of watching for that salt to melt. The salt is melted everywhere except the very heel of this knife. Again, because that heel is getting sucked some of that heat out by the bolster there. Let that bolster come up. And I actually am not really exceeding that temperature much, so it's kind of good. There we go. I'm all melted on there. I don't know how well this shows. See it? That yellow in the flame is actually sodium flare. So that sodium flare is telling me that the salt is burning off and everything. But it does make it a little harder to judge the color of the steel. So I'm going to do this again. I'm going to put the camera back where it was so you can see the quench. Bolster. Usually it's the tip of the knife that's going to overheat first. Almost always the tip. I've turned this back around so my heel's away. Keep an eye on it. Hopefully I can bring that bolster up at the same time. My edge is starting to get close. Heel is up, but it's not. Moving it around in here to find a spot in the forge that is heating pretty evenly. Looks pretty good. So with 1080, 1084, or 15 and 20, 1084, you don't need a soak time. You hit that temperature and you go in the oil. And even with ADC or V2 and that kind of steel, as long as you're close to that temperature of 1550, you don't really need that soak time. The soak time comes when you have an excess of carbon or something to break down like an excess of chromium. Alright, we're looking pretty even here. It's pretty nice. Heel a little hotter. Go right in the oil. Now this is quenching oil, but for this particular steel you could probably use canola, it'd be fine. Come out. Now I'm only going to go in for 15 seconds or so. Work a little bit. Try to get to. As long as this is over 450, I can straighten it. Where are my arms? There we go. Cool. Now, because I went several cycles, I won't get this everywhere, but I built up a little bit of scale. When you see this white like this, where it pops all the scale off, it's a really good indication that you went the proper temperature and you quenched fast enough. Shut this off. Now, if I check this right now, it'll still be soft because it's above 450. I want to make sure that my knife is dropped below 450 degrees before I check for hardness. If it's smoking the oil, it's too hot. It doesn't turn over to martensite, the hardened steel, until it goes below 400. Okay, so I have let this cool down. It's probably about 300 degrees or so. It's hot enough I don't want to touch it, but it's not so hot that I can't hold it with a rag. And it's definitely down below 400 degrees. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that this hardened the way it was supposed to. Now you can do that with a file, check to see if the file skates. That works with most steels, but it doesn't tell you very accurate information. Files are generally around 62 Rockwell, except when they're not. Some files are softer, and some files actually get up to 70, 72 Rockwell. The VG10 Nicholsons, you could fully harden this 100%, it'll cut with a file like butter because that file's always going to be harder than it. I like to use these. I manufacture these. These are Rockwell test chisels. Each of these is set to a specific Rockwell hardness, and it's within a half a point or so across the whole piece. This is 64, and I know that 1084, if it's fully hardened, gets 64, 65 Rockwell max. Same with the 15 and 20, 1080. So if I get this close to 64, I know it's fully hardened. So if I can cut this, I need to try again. If I can't, it should be good. And I can not cut that. You can hear it skating. Now, I will say, I did get a little bit of decarb. I can feel it grabbing. See how I'm grabbing at that edge? I'm going to scrape through that, and now I can't grab. So that's decarb. You have to watch for that. If you have a lot of decarb or scale on it from forging, you want to grind that off before you check to make sure it's hardened. That's hardened. Looks like my bolster even hardened also. Beautiful. Now that I'm sure this is hardened, I'm above 64, so I know I'm at least pretty close to optimally hardened. Then I'm going to put it in the oven. Now, I will always recommend doing an oven heat temper. If you don't have a kiln, many people don't, that's fine. You can use a toaster oven. Just put something with some thermal mass in there and check it against the temperature on the dial. They never read what they actually are. This one we used in the shop for years and years and years. It's still kind of sitting here because we can't barely throw it out. And all we do is, we had a little oven thermometer we stick in there and a piece of hard fire brick and just let it run for a while at 350 degrees, 375, whatever it was. Let it equal out and then mark on the dial, where each of the temperatures. This one maxed out, if we did it at 400 degrees, it was 375, that was all it would ever do. You can also use a kitchen oven, same thing. They hold temperature fairly well, but they don't always give you the right temperature. Another trick is to throw a bed of sand under the knife, because that'll help equalize the temperature. Both of these tend to fluctuate. They overshoot, then they let it cool down too far, and then it overshoots again. Just like kilns, except kilns will overshoot by 2-3 degrees, whereas this might be 25 or 30 degrees, enough to possibly overheat or undershoot the temper. So by adding some thermal mass, you kind of even out those ramps and get a good heat treat. But in any case, I'm going to put this in temper before it cracks, and I hope that you guys learned something. That's how I recommend doing a forge heat treat. If you're doing this in a coal forge rather than a propane forge, the same thing applies. Just even heat, check the temperature, run from that cooler temperature, and go from there. Coal forges are not any harder to heat treat in. They're actually some ways easier because you can control that atmosphere a little bit. You do have to maintain the fire a little better. And then since I have asthma, I hate them, and there's that. If you guys have any questions from this video, please feel free to ask. We'll see you next time.